How many of you have ever read or heard the story of the World War I Christmas truce between the Allies and the Germans? Yeah? Well, how many of you know? I'll tell it briefly in a minute. Well, for those of you that have heard this, how many of you are aware of the fact that that was the song that started it?
Yeah.
Now, for your benefit, I'll make this quick though, if we need to move along. During World War I, on Christmas Eve night, and of course, in World War I, it was a lot of trench warfare. You had the Germans on one side of this open field, and the Allied troops with a bunch of Americans on the other side. And there was an informal truce, or I should say ceasefire. It wasn't a truce, it was just a ceasefire that had lasted that evening. And the Germans started singing, well, of course, in German it's Stille Nacht, but the tune was exactly the same, and the words are close enough. The Americans recognized the song, and after a few minutes, the American troops joined in English. And after they had sung to each other back and forth across this open field, one German with a white flag braved what, of course, was no man's land and came out across the field. Of course, he had left his rifle behind. He was unarmed and approached the Allied lines to basically wish them a Merry Christmas. And then the Americans came out, and one by one, soldiers from each side came out. Some of them spoke English, and they basically had an informal truce between the Germans and the Americans, and ignored the war for several hours, and just decided it's Christmas, we're going to get along. Of course, later on Christmas Day, when the chain of command found out that there was this unauthorized truce going on and that soldiers from both sides were actually cavorting with each other, they pitched a holy fit over it and put a stop to it. But at least for several hours on Christmas Eve night and into Christmas Day, World War I, at least on that battlefield, came to a stop because some German soldiers started singing Silent Night. All right. And Stan, from what I understand of what I've read, and this part I don't know if it's true or not, because of course stories like that tend to get embellished over the years, but from what I have read, one of the Germans was a barber, and he set himself up a barber chair in the middle of no man's land and started cutting hair. So I've been told.
Could be possible.
All right. Revelation chapter 21. We left off at verse 10 on Wednesday. I will attempt to get through the rest of chapter 21. I know we only got 20 minutes left, but the rest of chapter 21, unlike a lot of the other passages, should go fairly quickly. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And names were written on them, which are those of the 12 tribes of the son of Israel. Now, of course, what he's talking about there is not the angels, but the gate, of course, had a name on there. And it's interesting that in the New Jerusalem, where no sin will be allowed, that God actually, even after all of creation is made new, has an angel guarding the gate. Theologians have been trying to dicker with that one for years, figuring out, why does God have a guard at the gate? But
Sure they weren't just a greeter?
Don't think it said Walmart over the top. But these are the three gates on the east, and there were three gates on the east, three gates on the north, three gates on the south, and three gates on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now you'll notice in the New Jerusalem, Israel and the church are combined here. The names of the gates are named after the 12 tribes of Israel, and the names of the foundation stones are the 12 apostles. So this is the first place in all of history that you see a distinct combining of Israel, or the Old Testament saints, together with the New Testament saints. I think this goes to show that at this point in what will be our history, I guess our future, that the distinction between the church and Israel becomes blurred, if at all possibly non-existent at this point. John does not tell us who the 12 tribes of Israel are, but I would venture to say probably would be the enumeration of the 12 tribes that he listed last, just a couple of chapters earlier, where Levi is now included again, and we have Joseph. Now, the reason I would say that, at least is my opinion, is because at this point, there's no longer a need for a priestly tribe. Levi was set aside as, the attendants and the priest within the nation of Israel. We don't need that anymore. All of us are priests. And each have inherited the kingdom equally. So my guess is that those 12 tribes would include Levi, Joseph, as opposed to Ephraim and Manasseh. Because, of course, if Joseph is listed with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, then somewhere one of the other tribes has got to go away. And so that reason, I think it's probably Joseph and Levi included. Now, the one thing also that John doesn't tell us, notice he just says that the foundation stones have the names of the 12 apostles. That's another big question that people have had over the centuries, is that 12th apostle Matthias or Paul?
I'm not going to hazard a guess.
My money's on Paul.
Yeah. I'll let you know when I see it.
Well, what if I get there first?
There you go.
Matthias was chosen by the other apostles, right?
Yes, they
Paul
cast
was
lots
chosen
for
by
him.
Jesus.
And that's the reason my money's on him. Because after that passage in Acts where the apostles went through the process of replacing Judas, Matthias is not heard or seen from after that. There's no historical records that I know of anywhere that even mentions him. But of course, Paul, we know, wrote, about a third of the New Testament. He was, even though by his count, the least of the apostles, as he liked to call himself, I don't think biblically you could make the case for him being the least of the apostles. I think, if anything, he and Peter could probably have flipped a coin as to which one was really the chief apostle. So, again, it's just pure speculation on my part, but my money is on Paul being number 12. Now, here's where it gets interesting, though. And the one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its walls. Now, that just reminds me, if any of you want to buy me a Christmas present, I want you to get me a gold tape measure.
Okay.
I can spray paint you on real quick.
I figured you would. But anyway, to measure the holy city, he doesn't have any ordinary measuring rod. He's got one that's made out of gold. Because as we continue in our description here, you'll find that while gold is a precious metal and probably only superseded by various, man-made metals like plutonium and platinum. Gold is considered the most valuable mineral, or not even mineral, metal, I should say, that you can find today. But in this description, you'll see that apparently gold flows like, sand, and, that's plenty to be had. Verse 16 says, the city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as the width, and he measured the city with the rod. Now, if you're looking at a King James or some of the other translations, I believe it what says about how many stadia?
12,000.
12,000 furlongs.
Yep. 12,000 stadia or furlongs. A stadion, that's the singular, is about 600 feet. And this rod that he would have been measuring with would have been a cubit rod, which is, of course, about 18 inches from here to here. Now, if you're looking at a newer translation, like I'm reading from the King James, it says 1,500 miles. If you do the math between 12,000 stadia, which again, 600 feet times 12,000, that comes out roughly to almost 1,500 miles. That's how big this city is. But what's really interesting about it, John says its length and width and height are equal. This city is a 1,500 mile cube.
It's a Borg cube.
A big one too.
A what kind of
A
cube?
Borg cube.
Borg.
A Borg?
It's a Star.
It's a Star Trek reference.
Okay.
Don't
Gotcha.
waste your brain cells.
It's not worth your brain power unless you're familiar with Star Trek.
Okay.
I saw someone did a calculation somewhere once on how many people could live in a city that large, and it would basically accommodate all the people who have ever existed.
Have ever existed with room to spare. I did a little math of my own. 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500 comes out to 3,375,000,000 cubic miles. So, yeah, when you figure that only God's people, only Christians out of all those people in the world would be in there,
It's going
going to have plenty of room.
Spacious.
And vertically, the biggest thing we've ever been able to build is a few, like 1,200, 1,400, 1,500 feet tall. The tallest buildings in the world. God's city's going to be 1,500 miles tall.
Which also,
God can do anything.
consider this, we tend to think two-dimensionally. And by that, I mean, just consider where we are right now, at least in this respect. I know as soon as I say this, Meryl's going to say, no, we're not, we're three-dimensional. We tend to be two-dimensional beings in that we tend to think, this way. We rarely think of ourselves this way. Now, you even being a flyer, what, as they say, what goes up comes down.
No, and astronauts too.
Yeah.
You do an astrophysics.
Right. We just don't tend to think vertically. It's just not in our makeup. We tend to think we're right here on the ground. This city is 1,500 miles high, which in today's environment would put us way out into outer space. Now, of course, we have no idea what God's new earth is going to look like. That may be something that just doesn't apply anymore. But here's my question in all this. And that's all it is, because I don't even know enough about this and just what this tells us to really have a good speculation. All we can do is guess. But we tend to think of ourselves, because we are bound by gravity. We're, here on the earth, on the ground. We got to have special equipment in order to get vertically, either a plane, a balloon, or something. And as they say, if you go up, sooner or later, you're going to come back down. What kind of city, or for that matter, what would change in the physics of the universe that would allow us to live comfortably in a vertical city that's 1,500 miles high?
No gravity. Lack of gravity,
I don't know, you know.
Yeah, so we.
Or-
Or minimal gravity.
A new heaven and a new earth.
Who knows if we even will need an atmosphere to breathe?
That's another
You
good
know.
question. Is,
Energy,
you know,
pure energy.
Could be dimensions too, an extra dimension.
but I mean, just trying to get your mind around, I mean, thinking a city that's 1,500 miles this way and 1,500 miles that way, that, you know, you just think, oh, that's a really big place. That would cover half of the continental United States. But when you start thinking this way, you can't get your mind around it, because in our minds, our experience is all, you know, two-dimensional, and that high, that's not even anywhere near the surface of the earth. For all we know, the earth that God's going to create could be the size of Jupiter, or infinite. We have no way of knowing. All I'm saying at this point is, to get your mind around this, we're going to have to, we'll have to think completely out of the box and dismiss anything that we know about the modern laws, or I should say modern, physical, I think is a better word, the physical laws of the universe, the laws of physics. I have a feeling that maybe they won't even exist anymore, that God will completely rework the universe as we know it.
I'm just,
He's
must
the
be,
light. He's the light. You're getting near the speed of light. Things change that we don't even understand.
Mhm.
And I think that's, we used to talk about this at work all the time. Just how physics change so much, speed of light.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and that's, he even told us he's the light. So
I guess I'm just simple, cause I just say God's got it, and I guess I don't even think in that kind of depth of worry about anything. It's just like, God's got it.
Mhm.
God's got it.
Pastor,
But-
can I ask one quick question?
Shoot.
Is 1,500 by 1,500? What was the Promised Land about? Is this any relation to the Promised
Oh,
Land?
no, the Promised Land was
Was not-
way smaller
Well,
than
it's a couple
this.
hundred miles, right?
Yeah, from
Mediterranean back-
north to south,
Okay.
from the Euphrates River to Egypt would be, I don't know, probably what, 300-400 miles, something like that. But then from the Mediterranean Sea to the desert would only be at most 100 miles.
Yeah, okay.
So we're talking an area of land that wouldn't even begin to compare with this. But now, I find verse 17 also very revealing if you actually kind of read into what he's saying. And he measured its wall 72 yards, and realized that, I'm translating it, that's 144 cubits if you're reading from some of the other translations. And just a reminder, a cubit's about 18 inches, but that translates to 72 yards according to human measurements, which are also angelic measurements. Now, if the measuring rod this angel is using, which equals a cubit, and John is saying this is what it is according to human, a human cubit, but then he goes on to say, which are also angelic. In other words, a cubit for that angel was the same length as it was for him. What does that tell us about the appearance of an angel?
They're like us.
They're just like us. People think of an angel as some huge being or whatever. Angels are apparently the same size we are. They may be stronger, but they're no bigger than us. Verse 18, and the material of the wall was jasper. The city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. You hear people talking about the pearly gates of heaven. It comes from this, but again, any reference to the so-called pearly gates of heaven, guess what? This isn't heaven. This is the New Jerusalem. So when you hear people talking about the pearly gates, they got it completely wrong. Oh, one thing I almost forgot. I knew there was something else I was going to mention. Notice this city is a 1,500-mile cube. What else do we see that was a cube? Anybody remember?
The internal structure of the ark.
You're close. The Holy of Holies in the temple.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
The Holy of Holies was a cube. And within the Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant was, which was symbolic of God's throne. So what you've got here is, in the New Jerusalem, it's not that this is a representation of the Holy of Holies, it's actually the other way around. The Holy of Holies is a small model of God's throne here.
That's what I was trying to figure out the similarity for you.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you.
And in fact, we see as we go on, John makes it clear there's no temple and nothing here that you have no place to go to worship, which we'll get to that in a second. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl. Imagine how big that pearl is.
Imagine how big the oyster was.
Yeah, that oyster would eat you. The streets of the city were pure gold like transparent glass. Verse 22, another important point. And I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. So instead of having to go somewhere to worship, what John is telling us is that in the holy city, everywhere you're in the presence of God. Worship is everywhere.
And all
There's-
the time.
And at all times. There is no need for a temple because God inhabits every place. If you're in the New Jerusalem, you're in the presence of God. There's just no need for a separate temple here. Verse 23, and the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine upon it. Again, the complete change in the laws of physics as we know them now in the universe, because what does God use other than his own personal word? What does God use to keep the earth in place? Gravity from the sun. We're constantly going around the sun, and the moon's going around the earth, and all that works together in perfect balance to keep the earth exactly the way God wants it. You'll notice here, God has created a new earth, and there is no sun. We're just out there somewhere, and wherever that turns out to be, God is what's holding everything in place, and there's no sun, no moon, because Christ himself is the light. It kind of gives new meaning to you when Christ said that I am the light of the world. He meant that quite literally. The city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine upon it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. And the nations, now here's another one. Notice this, and the nations shall walk by its light, and the kings of the earth shall bring their glory into it. Now, I actually read one commentator that tried to claim that unsaved people would continue to populate and go on, or that are not even unsaved people so much as those who had accepted Christ during the millennial kingdom, but that they would continue on into eternity in their same physical bodies to repopulate. Is absolutely nonsensical. That's ridiculous, and I'll tell you why. Look in verse 27. Let's drop down to there. And nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Now, even if we are Christians, as long as we are in these physical bodies, guess what? We still sin. We are subject to sin because our bodies, even if our spirits have been made new, our bodies have a sin nature. And that will be something that will be inherited right on down the line until the last man standing. If God is telling us that no abomination will ever enter into the New Jerusalem, The only way that that can possibly happen is if at some point, and that's why I mentioned this last week, that I think evidence points to the millennial saints being judged and then given resurrection bodies at the great white throne, because they cannot enter into eternity in a sinful body, because if they did, they'd never be admitted into the New Jerusalem, because they're sinners. And God isn't going to allow sin here. But anyway, back to verse 24. I read one commentator that tried to claim that these millennial saints would not be given resurrection bodies and that they would continue to repopulate. Well, the second problem is if we're going to live there for eternity and people are allowed to repopulate, guess what?
Sooner or later, you're going to run out of
Sooner or
room.
later. It may take a long time to get there, but eventually you're going to run out of room. God's going to have to make something bigger. I don't think, that's going to happen. Otherwise, I think God would have, or John would have said so. Doesn't mention that at all. And Jesus himself said that in the resurrection, there's no longer giving or taking in marriage. And if our millennial saints, if they aren't given resurrection bodies, they're going to be excluded, because even if they're saved, I don't even have to take a poll in here, because I already know the answer, as all of us do. We're all saved in here, but how many of us before this week is out are going to have a few sins under our belt? Yeah, of course. God isn't going to allow that. Will be excluded. No abomination, no sin will be allowed. The only way around that is those millennial saints will at some point, and I think great white throne judgment is the most likely possibility, they will be resurrected or translated into a resurrection body. And at that point, there'll be no longer any giving or taking in marriage. There'll be no more sinning. And so that gives us back to square one on verse 24, that who are the nations that they're talking about? Well, I think this gives us another possibility here. I've had some people ask over the years, well, will we know each other? Are we going to change? Are we going to all be the same color, the same type? And I think clearly this tells us that even in the resurrection, we will still have an identity, an ethnicity, that those who have dark skin will probably continue to have dark skin. Those who have light skin or straight hair or curly hair or whatever the racial characteristic is, will continue to demonstrate that.
Or if you don't have any here.
I feel for you. Guess you get left behind.
You're not far behind.
Well, I'm not the only one in here that's.
Yeah. So you'll be in good company.
Yeah. There's only 2 men in this whole room that even have a half of a head of hair.
The balding nation will be well represented.
There you go.
Skinny.
But I think this goes to show us that even in the resurrection, there will still be an ethnic identity. Well, even back at the beginning of our study of Revelation, in chapter 4, when John was describing the scene around the throne of God right after the rapture, he said that he looked out on the sea of people, and you remember what he said? That he could see people of all nations, tongues, and races. So even in the resurrection, John has already told us back in chapter 4, those racial identities will continue. It's just that our issues with each other, discrimination, racism, all of that stuff, that will be done away with. We won't have any ill feelings toward each other because of where we're from or what language we used to speak. But the nations will still be represented in that respect. Verse 25 says, in the daytime, says, for there shall be no night there. Its gates shall never be closed. Well, that tells us that the gates won't be closed at all, because it's going to be daytime 24 hours a day. And even the term 24 hours a day will no longer really apply. I think there's two reasons why there's no night, that it's always daytime. Because at that point, what has happened, or what will have happened to time?
No more.
There is no more time. If there's a day and a night, that implies that there's a cycle, there's time going by.
But it already said that the sun is there and the sun is the light, so therefore, sun, S-O-N.
Yeah. Well, that's the second reason is,
Yeah, for it to be dark, Jesus would have to leave.
there you go. If Jesus is the light,
That's what I was
then if he's eternally present, then there's going to be eternal daylight. Because as Meryl just mentioned, and Connie too, that, you know, that would imply that Jesus would have to cover his face or he'd have to leave, and that's not going to happen. So, yes, Jesus is there at all times, and again, any semblance of a passage of time will simply cease to exist.
That's what eternity means.
Yep.
Well, if we're always waiting for it to end, you know.
Can you imagine no clock or no calendar?
Yeah.
Can you? 'Cause
No, I
you know, you think about it too long, you get your brain all twisted up.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking about, I don't have to worry about, well, when's that appointment? It's like, who cares? I get there when I get there.
Yeah.
But
And-
it's just like us getting old now. We look at us getting old now and we're like, when will it ever end? Eternity, if we had to worry about that for eternity.
Mhm.
That's
So-
why the new body.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
I don't-
my God.
But we won't be constrained by time.
Right.
We won't know that 2,500 years have passed.
That's why I don't think it's.
All right, let's finish this up. So they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. There's an interesting thing is, I think more important is what John doesn't say in verse 26. He said, and I think this is one of the reasons that God will allow this ethnicity or national identity to continue, is all the good that is represented by the various races, by the nations, God will allow to come in and to glorify him. But notice John says nothing of any detractors, nothing that, well, like, let me give you a good example. Right now, if I say Russia, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
Cold War.
Cold War,
Evil.
evil, atheism. When somebody was to say Russia 1,000 years from now, you won't be thinking that. You'll be thinking, what a great people. You'll be thinking about the people that glorified Russia, not the ones that brought evil to it. As Ronald Reagan said, the evil empire. That won't be there anymore. Only that which glorified God. Nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life.
Continuous love.
There's one last thing, and again, I don't think John is saying this, but it's at least worth considering. Are angels' names in the book of life? Or the question would be, is this city going to be people only, and the only angels will be outside the gate guarding? I mean, I can't imagine that being the case because, well, if God is there and angels, seraphim, cherubim, by whatever, holy order they are all part of God's kingdom, I can't imagine God saying, no, you guys have to stay outside. And so either John is specifically talking about people, or I have to ask, is that book of life more than just humans? Does it include God's angels?
Well, we're told that we're going to judge the angels
Yeah, we are. Jesus himself said that.
and their messengers.
Mm-hmm.
So they're probably going to bring food to our cabin.
Don't
I
the
got-
angels get sorted into the same group of goats and sheep? Goats and lambs?
It's a possibility.
I mean, there are the angels who rebelled, the angels who followed Satan.
Mhm.
Obviously, their names are not written in the book.
Obviously.
So I would think that, yes, they have the same division between the goats and the lambs that we
And that
do.
is a distinct possibility. Again, that's one of those things John doesn't state, but from what he doesn't say, you have to wonder if that's the case. But to your comment, and I'll finish with this because we're out of time here. Unlike the caricatures that you see of people drawing these heavenly scenes of sitting around with wings on a cloud and playing your harp, that there can't be anything farther from the biblical truth. There are not going to be any clouds that we're sitting around on. The Bible did say that the millennial saint, the tribulation saints that are martyred will be given harps, I guess just musical instruments to bide their time. I don't know. But
There
no,
won't
we
be no
don't.
time.
Huh?
It won't bide their time.
Yeah.
There won't be time.
We don't get wings. We don't need wings because if we have a body like Christ, we can come and go as we want to and just think, walk through walls or disappear here and appear over there. If Christ can do it and we have a body like His, we'll be able to do it. But now here's my point. I know there actually is a point in this. The idea of heaven as being this eternal rest where we're sitting around doing nothing but sleeping and strumming harps, not biblical. I think we're going to be working and actually have jobs to do and things to keep busy with. I mean, can you imagine spending eternity and having nothing to do?
Can you imagine washing all the windows in a 1,500 mile?
I was thinking of that a while ago.
Scraping.
Well, look at it this way. At least you don't have to worry about the outside because there probably won't be any air out there. But it's going to be a place of work, a place where we're going to be doing stuff. We'll have jobs and things to do. The difference is, in this world, because of the fall of humanity, because of sin, we think of work as being tiresome, laborious, not work, but labor. It's almost like we have been sentenced, because of our sin, to hard labor. That won't be the case anymore. Work will be something enjoyable. Just like God told Adam and Eve to tend His garden. It wasn't meant as a punishment because God knew they would enjoy doing that. And that they could do it without any impediments, that they weren't going to just, be tired and achy all the time until they sinned. I think we're going to be back to that. We'll be working, but what we'll be doing will be enjoyable and be something that we like to do. All right, anyway, that's my thought on it. Questions this evening?
Just think, no more phones.
Are you sure? She'll find you anyway, one way or the other. All right, Mary.